Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Well, I read this week that there is no peak oil demand any day soon, that the demand is going to keep on rising in the world. The Prime Minister and Ottawa in general seems to be sending a series of mixed messages on this. There's build baby bills and make us an energy superpower. There is also legislation that is a little unclear as to how the process will unfold, but it seems to be progress, so we'll look at that. The Prime Minister has also said that energy security will be a core mission for Canada as the G7 leaders meet and discuss these issues. And then, of course, the world is now witnessing the Israeli strike on Iran, and we're seeing reactions in the price of oil and other issues. So we are going to take a look at all of that. The reason we were going to have this discussion in the first place was a new report from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And it was really looking, well, I'll read the title, Imbalance of Power, How Federal Overreach, meaning the regulatory system and moving into provincial jurisdiction, fuels Western alienation. So we're going to get to that as well. The authors of this report, Sonya, the former Minister of Energy and the former Minister of the Environment in Alberta. She's now senior counsel at Borden Labner Gervais and a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And Heather Exner-Pirot. Okay, you're becoming a regular on the podcast here, Heather, and we're thrilled about that. Heather is a senior fellow and director of energy, natural resources, and the environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a special advisor to the Business Council of Canada, and working with the Indigenous Resource Network to put these issues together. So, ladies, welcome and thank you. And it's almost, where the heck do we start this morning? You're both in Calgary, so I'm assuming you have helicopters flying above and you're seeing famous people arrive and leave and do whatever. Sonya, you're close to the
I live close to just west of the airport in Calgary, and I'm seeing things fly over I've never seen before. Types of helicopters and military aircraft, and it's pretty continuous. It's a big deal.
Yeah, it is a very big deal. And when you have that many world leaders gathering and meeting, there's an awful lot of security. Are you safe and sound, Heather? Are you away from the helicopters? Are they protecting you?
I'm safe and sound. I'm just on the west end of Calgary, not too far from the number one. So I've seen, more cops, I think, figure out what the transportation route and that kind of thing. I never know if it's because of G7 or because of, bikers are once again moving through and enjoying their rides in the spring here in Kananaskis.
Well, they took away one of my parking lots in downtown Calgary beside my office for staging of the VIP vehicles, and it's filled with vehicles. So it's a big deal in the city.
Well, at least they're doing it at Kananaskis, where they can kind of control it out there. All right, let's start with, if we can, with the Israeli move. Honestly, it's quite breathtaking to watch what they have done. But of course, the markets have reacted. So, Heather, just a view on that, what it means for oil prices. And, in a way, it does really focus the leaders on energy supply.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so we saw spikes over 10%. It's climbed down a little bit, but still, a couple dollars higher than it was 2 days ago. So on the one hand, for producers, this is good. We'll see how long it lasts. This one does seem to be a bit more serious than, maybe the last few strikes. But I have to reiterate that, $70 WTI is not a high price for oil historically at all, especially given the inflation we've seen the last few years. That would be the equivalent to $63 or $65 5 years ago. So oil prices are still not high. And why is that? Because I think that's all part of it, Senator, is that Donald Trump came in with two competing goals. One was drill, baby, drill. And one was to reduce inflation and energy prices. And he's clearly favored reducing inflation and energy prices and has done a lot of policy to bring that down. So that's what's really been suppressing the oil price. Also, the wink and the nod and allowing OPEC to release its excess, its spare capacity onto the market. But it seems as though we probably hit the bottom. And commodities in general, metals, we're already seeing a bit of a surge. We saw gold hitting all-time highs. Uranium has been spiking. Cameco has hit its own all-time high stock price this week, and several other metals. So it looks like people are moving into commodities as you have a lot more global unrest, and as currency reserves aren't quite as attractive.
What's your sense, Sonya, what the world map is right now?
Well, I was just going to add that when I was energy minister, I saw everything from oil at negative prices to close to $100 a barrel. So anytime you have instability in prices, it sends shockwaves. Higher price of oil is great for the Alberta government for royalties, but it causes all sorts of other issues. So it's something I'll be following closely.
And what do you think the issues are when we look at the G7 discussions? We've got everybody there, with the exception really of Russia, but that has been also a key player. We've watched what's happened in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what that's done to Europe. Is this? Are we going to see some movement on this, or is it a Canadian priority more than a G7 priority?
I would say, go ahead, Sonya.
Oh, good. I was just going to say, I'm just looking at some of the documents coming out of Ottawa for G7, and it's a remarkable change from what we saw in the last 10 years, with the focus seeming to be on energy security, critical minerals, and the economy. We never saw that under Justin Trudeau. It was always a bouquet of other interests. And also, interestingly, they're not trying to have a communique at the end of the process. That's always been the things. When I was at EMMC and first ministers or territorial and provincial federal ministers conferences, the whole thing was about getting that communique. So
the
whole thing was about it. So this is big. It's a big change.
Yeah. I think that the impossibility of trying to find language at this point that everybody could agree to, with the uncertainty everywhere, it's probably very smart just to, have some general statements about how everybody's going to work together and they care about this. Let's put this in the context of Ottawa, because your Premier Smith, said just the other day she sees some encouraging signs from the actions in Ottawa. We have the legislation that's sitting there now, Bill C5, that's supposed to be looking at this. So before we drill down a little bit, Sonya, to you, and then to Heather, what do you make of it, Sonya?
Well, you're right. The Premier, and she just spoke at the Global Energy Show this week and had numerous roundtables around it. And she does seem to be optimistic. She's closer to those inside discussions. Well, she's in the middle of those inside discussions. So if she says she's seen some signs of optimism, she's obviously heard that. Bill C5, specifically the Building Canada Act portion of it, looks encouraging. I'm trying to decipher through it and figure out all the yes buts. How is it going to work? It seems like it's fairly high level, thrown together quite quickly. Looks good, sounds good. There's a lot of details to be sorted out on whether it's going to actually speed up processes or whether it's going to cause confusion and result in a lot of other processes to try to deal with processes.
Yeah, that's the question, Heather. And certainly, again, kind of a mixed message. We're not going to undo Bill C-69. We're not going to lift the emissions caps. We're not going to do any of that. But we're going to give Prime Minister, it seems, with this so-called Henry VIII clause, the permission to circumvent all of this if he so chooses for one project or another, something that he sees as acceptable.
Yeah, and I'll just, tie this all together. A lot of what's happening in Canada is a result of external pressure, and the world is going into a more volatile, unpredictable, scarier world. We're seeing that every week. We saw it yesterday. And it's no longer acceptable for Canada to be that reluctant energy producer. And I would say it's not Canada pushing the G7 towards energy security. It's the G7, where finally Canada is stepping out and being that source, or saying it's going to be that source of energy and minerals going forward, which we absolutely need. So now we're starting to see the impacts domestically, and again, it's a Liberal government that happens to be in power. If a Conservative one obviously would have done that too, but no government, I don't think in 2025 in Canada, cannot address this issue of energy and resource development. It's obviously not ideal, C5, in terms of the whole context of all proponents, of all projects. We need to unleash hundreds, not just 3 or 4. But obviously, I think everyone's very willing to give Carney the benefit of the doubt. Him and Hodgson have said and done all the right things. It's only been a couple of weeks. And Carney has his hands full with, his own caucus and his own base. And I think people respect that he has to manage, those concerns and those different interests very carefully, even as I think it's inevitable, the trajectory that Canada has to go on.
So just on that point, I mean, he does have Stephen Guilbeault still in his cabinet, and he's now in charge of deciding whether or not we're going to expand parks. And we did see your premier kind of push back to Mr. Guilbeault, say, don't think you're going to be using the expansion of national parks to get into the area where we need to develop resources.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the back and forth of how serious are we about building Canada versus pursuing climate goals. There's years and there's a full decade of skepticism about what Ottawa's doing goes back to Trudeau. So we've built into our psyche and our nature here in Alberta, Saskatchewan as well, that we don't trust Ottawa. So it's hard to believe sometimes that what they're saying now about building things, about exempting projects from regulations that would hold it back, about accelerating regulatory process, to some extent, it's hard to believe, and it's hard to trust. And it's harder to trust when you still have Guilbeault at the table. But I'm prepared to give them the benefit of the doubt. You don't bring forward legislation like Bill 5. Right. That says those types of things without taking significant risk. Imagine if Stephen Harper had brought forward Bill 5 that says Cabinet has the right to declare projects in the national interest, and when that happens, it's not an automatic yes, but it's a shift of focus to how we build projects, not whether. You basically eliminated public consultation and public participation. Imagine if Stephen Harper had done that. Well, that's something Mark Carney has done, so it's bold.
But that's the both the upside and the downside, Heather, which is if you give this extraordinary power to the Prime Minister to say, okay, that project's a go, and I'm going to ignore Quebec jurisdiction or BC jurisdiction or Alberta jurisdiction, it seems like that could unleash a whole other round of debate and discussion.
Well, and we've seen the pendulum too far to the left and too far to the right, and Sonya knows this. That is not what business leaders ask for. They would like, some certainty, and you want to know your project's going to take more than a single government's term to build. So you want to know that in the next government's term, everything isn't going to be upside down. We face this problem today. Is that under Harper, it was under legislation. I think was it Sonya C 2012 that the minister was given a veto and designation powers, and that was to help projects. So everyone, I think, turned a blind eye and said, okay, this is good. But then, of course, under Trudeau, that was used against you, that now the minister can veto and designate projects that you did want to go forward. So overall, in the long term, I think business and the private sector would like less political interference, less governments picking and choosing winners. And like we say, we're willing to give the benefit of the doubt, and it's signaling movement. It's signaling, a different environment in Canada. It's signaling to investors that we do want to build. And so I appreciate it for those characteristics. But still, the government will have to do the work of just improving our regulatory processes. And we'll get into the conversation. A lot of that is just getting the federal government out of approving projects that are under provincial jurisdiction.
Well, 100%. I just wanted to add, for the number of projects that will be designated by cabinet to be in the national interest, I don't know, will there be 5? Will there be 15? There's a handful of them, and they're exempted and they're fast-tracked. There's thousands of projects that'll be left behind, and they're still subject to Bill C-69, to all of the onerous regulations, which the big projects could find exemptions from. that will make an impact for those projects that aren't designated to attract capital and investment and joint venture partners. It could have the unintended consequences of putting some of those other projects at a competitive disadvantage.
Well, you put out some numbers, I think, this week, Heather, that, the lead time for a mining project approval to stand it up is in Canada 20 years.
Yeah.
This is stunning.
It's shocking, and to be fair, to just come out of this is a global trend, and part of it is that we're just in a part of the commodity cycle where the mining sector nowhere has been getting a lot of investment following the commodities bust that started happening in 2014. But then part of it is the regulatory system, and I had to compare also. In Australia, it's at 14 years. Here in Canada, it's at 19.9 years. So that's not how long to get a permit. That's the discovery, that's the getting investment, moving to final investment decision, and then the regulatory and the approval, and then the construction. So absolutely, it's unacceptable. Again, just for our own supply chain security.
Right.
And you can't, okay, you want to have an energy transition. Not if it takes you 19.9 years to get the nickel and the copper and the cobalt and the graphite and the iron and all those things moving. So we'll get into, there are some really good ways that we could improve permitting in this country and move things faster. And that's not what's on the table right now.
Yeah, and the other figure there, the number of major natural resource projects in the wider world here completed between 2015 and 2023 declined by more than a third. And most everybody just says this is the punishing set of policies and regulations that are put in place. You don't have proponents for pipelines or other projects because they don't know what the rules are, Sonya.
They 100%. They don't know. Every investor kind of works towards one main answer: is when will this project be built? When will there be a return in investment? What will that return be? If you can't answer that question, boards of directors aren't going to sanction an FID a project. That's been a tremendous problem in Canada for almost everything you want to build. It's been an issue, and this will take some uncertainty. The Building Canada Act hopefully will take some uncertainty out of it for some projects, but the other projects are stuck in the mud with C69. I almost said C69, the greenwashing bill. That's still in place, which is going to impact everything.
And the emissions caps and all of those issues. So I guess it comes back, and I do want to get back here for a moment to your actual report that you two did together, because it's in a way it's sort of the flip side, the federal overreach into these areas by trying to regulate everything and come into provincial jurisdiction. There's no sense that they're going to lift those laws, Heather. They're just going to circumvent them. It was the same with the carbon tax. We're going to take it down to zero, the consumer carbon tax, but we're going to leave it on the books. So it's always a question mark in the back of everybody's mind, like, when can this be reasserted again?
Yeah. And so we go through that. And I want to make the point, and Danielle Smith had her list of 9 demands, that got a lot of people's hackles up, as if this was an outrageous list. And as Sonya and I described, most of those are things that are probably unconstitutional. Some of them that have already been found to be unconstitutional. Right. So most of what Alberta is asking for is for the government to honor the Constitution. And we kind of go through, why is this such an emotional issue? Not only, because we've been fighting for this in Alberta and Saskatchewan in particular since 1930 and before that, of trying to assert and get confirmation acknowledgement that we do have jurisdiction over non-renewable resources and electricity. And in particular, in the last 10 years, but in some episodes before that, throughout Canadian history, the federal government in Ottawa has really tried to, put its hands into those pockets. And so I think these are very reasonable demands. And she said, Sonya was there at the Global Energy Show. This is the short list. There's 100 things we could think of that annoy us, but these 9 in particular, are just unacceptable, that you will not see investment. I would say you could build 6 pipelines If you don't improve the rest of the system, no one will be able to fill them. You could build 2 ports, you could build 6 railways. No one will be able to mine to use those ports and to use those railways. So those big nation building projects is only one end of the supply chain.
Sonya, why don't you just give us a little bit of that historical perspective? I mean, as a young reporter, one of the first stories I covered was the NEP and the National Energy Plan with Trudeau won and Peter Lougheed, and it was war. I don't mean to use the word lightly, but this was a fight for who controls and owns these resources and gets to make decisions about them, and Western Canada was kind of left out of that, came in later. And then when we got the NEP, it was a reminder of all of the things that had been so long fought for. Just give us your thumbnail on that.
Yeah, well, I think sort of as we approached this paper, I mean, we started with looking at what are the current grievances. And it's not just about a pipeline, that we can't get a pipeline built. The amount of times when I was minister, and even after, when I'd complain about Ottawa government policy, are unable to get a pipeline built, I would get dozens of responses back from Eastern Canada to remind us, well, we gave you a pipeline. We built and paid for TMX. We gave you a pipeline. What on earth is wrong with you? And it's not about a pipeline. It's not just about a pipeline. It goes back 130 years. It goes back to when Alberta became a province. It goes back to being treated differently. Saskatchewan and Alberta were treated differently when they became provinces in 1905. We didn't own the resources like all the eastern provinces did. It took a constitutional amendment and the NRTA, Natural Resources Transfer Act of 1930, to be given the same rights. Then you fast forward to what you just spoke about, the National Energy Program. In the 1970s, Ottawa tried to confiscate those rights, take the wealth and redistribute it across Canada. So we have the constitutional rights. It didn't seem like it counted for much when the NEP came along. So Peter Lougheed and Alan Blakely negotiated a constitutional amendment, the Resource Amendment, Section 92A, to really fortify the provincial rights and a reminder that Alberta and Saskatchewan provinces had exclusive jurisdiction over the production, management, conservation of natural resources, including oil and gas, electricity, minerals. And even after that, we saw more recently, for the last 10 years, which is really what has enraged the provinces to this date, is we've seen, even with all of that, with being granted the ownership rights, with a fortification of those rights under 92A, that none of that even counted. When it came to Justin Trudeau's climate policies, he would completely trample the Constitution and provincial rights to achieve his objectives, and it didn't matter. And it didn't even matter when the court stepped in and said, what you're doing is unconstitutional.
Exactly. Yeah.
He ignored it anyways and proceeds on. So, it's frustrating when you hear from Eastern Canada that we gave you a pipeline. Well, it's not about a pipeline.
I have this conversation all the time with friends in the East, which is, stop whining. You've got a pipeline. There's so little understanding, or you're just angry, or you're just stamping your feet. Like, this is a much larger question than whether or not I might be annoyed or any of you might be annoyed or frustrated. It's pretty fundamental to how the country runs, Heather.
It is. So, and I'll give you an example, and we can talk about the emissions cap. And you always hear Alberta saying this is essentially a cap on production. Why does Alberta always say that? Because if it's just a cap on emissions, there may be a way and Sonya can get it, our resident lawyer, can talk about how it can fit under SEPA, the Environmental Protection Act, and with the criminal law power. But if it affects production, now you're clearly, overreached into provincial. And so the government has gone out of its way, and I would say some methodology and some calculations that I find very dodgy, to say there's no impact on production, it's only on emissions. And of course, anyone with basic common sense, and everyone in the Calgary oil and gas sector will say, you can't make us put all of our money and all of our profits and raise funds just purely to reduce emissions, never, no money left over for profits or for shareholders or for putting money into growing production, and say that you're not impacting production. These are publicly traded companies that have to operate in the context of, the regular market system. So it's these kinds of, strategies that we would rather not talk about Ottawa or the federal government at all in Saskatchewan, Alberta. We would rather just go and do our own thing. It's the frustration of, you're getting in our way. We could do so much. We could be stronger. We could be more powerful. We could be richer. And you guys are actively preventing this from happening.
Yeah, I think it is such a different world view. And I was going to ask you about the arrival of Michael Sabia, who on one level is echoing your words, Heather, that we could be an energy superpower, but, we have to have the drive. Then he says, I think his phrase was, there's an ambition deficit. Yes. You talked about an attitudinal problem in terms of growing. But there's this mentality, which is stakeholder versus shareholder, right? Because if you talk about stakeholder, that's everybody. That's everybody that lives in the community. It's the Indigenous communities. It's the environmental communities, et cetera. Where the companies have to look at these issues from the shareholder point of view. We're in this business to make money and do the right thing. So there seems to be a fundamental disconnect there, or maybe it can be worked with. So, Sonya, I'll maybe go to you first on this, because you've got lots of experience dealing with the Fed-Prov relationships.
Yeah, and I would just have to add that we've got a different tone out of Ottawa now, with Tim Hodgson having sat on boards and coming from a business background. Michael Sabia, same, coming from Hydro-Quebec. They will approach things differently. They will approach things as I hope they'll approach things, at least at the start, until politics strangles them and kind of sucks them into the vortex, but handle making decisions how businesses do, and not just purely for partisan, not just purely. Justin Trudeau, I think half of the things he decided on was how do I provoke the Conservatives and upset them? How do I provoke the provinces? How do I create wedge issues? We're not going to see any of that coming from business leaders. Business leaders just want to get things done. They want to build things and do things and get things done. So I'm hoping the coming in of Michael Sabia is a reflection of that. They're going to, I would be quite concerned from what I've seen from in the provincial government and seeing how the federal government operates. And before that, coming from the pipeline industry, watching how it works. They're going to struggle with the bureaucrats and the departments and the massive amount of bureaucracy in Ottawa that's just generally doesn't get things done. They're going to struggle with that in processes, and that'll be a test of time to see if they can maneuver around in all of that.
Heather, just to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about the stakeholder versus shareholder worlds.
Yeah, and I will say in Canada, we've been, struck by some kind of curse for the last 10 years where there's very anti-corporate, anti-business attitude on all sides. And I would have a hard time finding a more anti-business conservative party than we've seen, coming out of, the last few years here. Where it's very populist, is very much about workers, very anti-business association, that kind of thing. And so I'm going to give Carney credit. And of course, Carney and Hodgson and Sabia all have that experience to say, I've said, we appreciate what you're doing. Thank you, oil and gas sector, for what you've contributed to this country, which they have not heard in many, many years. And so, we all want great schools and great roads and great hospitals and all these things. You have to create wealth before you can distribute it. And we've seen what happens when you don't care about the job creators, you don't care about attracting investment, and you don't, have an attitude that says, actually, profits are good. Because if Canadian companies cannot make profits, there will be no Canadian companies. And they are moving, and Sonya knows this too. so many, even of Canadian companies, all their capital expenditures are going in other countries where they can make a better return.
Yep,
So
for sure.
if we're going to say we're anti-corporate, anti-profit, there's nothing left to charge taxes on. And so I am optimistic that at least with this government, they do appreciate the role that the private sector, that corporations play in the health of the national economy.
All right. So when we hear all of the discussion, because this comes back to your paper, which is the feeling of Western alienation. I'm not, there's a whole range of issues there, from anger to, and we're leaving, to we just want a fairer system. If you are seeing what you're seeing now, and I know you both kind of said, let's wait and see what the meat on the bone is before we actually make any predictions. But if there are a couple of projects that move forward, if there are signals that there will be another pipeline or another project at Churchill or whatever it may be, is that going to quell that, or that lack of trust that you talked about, Sonya? Is it too embedded now?
I think it'll settle some things down. It'll certainly settle the soft separatists down. People who just don't like the status quo. They really don't want to leave Canada, but they don't like the status quo. I think that'll soften that. In Alberta, there's always an element, and we've seen it for 40, 50 years. And even during my time in government, it was there. And there's always an element of 5 to 10% in the province who want out of Canada. That's not going to go away. It hasn't gone away even before Justin Trudeau came in. But I think you can soften the most vocal elements of Western alienation. But he's going to have to deliver. Talk only works for so long. There has to be some element of delivery. And that's where I think the hard part is going to be. That's where they're going to have to figure out how Bill 5, the Building Canada Act, is actually going to work with all it's confusing. They're going to have to find a way for it to work. They're going to have to find a way to bring in their own caucus, the Liberal caucus, who probably doesn't like that, to bring in stakeholders and the bureaucracy. So I'm optimistic, but they're going to have to deliver.
You've also got, Heather, this notion, and you hear it from the Bloc and from folks in Quebec, which is your whole talk of separation and having a different worldview is just silly. We have a different cultural background. We've got a language difference. Oil and gas is not culture. But in fact, you argue that it is, in the sense of a commitment to creating, of doing, and being entrepreneurial, and really the level of activity, that it does reflect a difference in a different kind of, or a different part of Canada.
Yeah, and the founders, I think, understood this. Go back to 1867 and in 1905. This is a large, geographically and culturally diverse country. And there's no reason that we should all have the same values and interests and follow the same things. And the Constitution allows us to have different ways to approach different things. And so it is, again, all we need to do is honor the Constitution as we all agreed to it, as we all entered it, the way that it was written, and you would quell so much of the frustration. That if you could just allow us, to control our own non-renewable resources and our own electricity, and that would give us, if Quebec doesn't want to do those things, honestly, that doesn't bother me at all. But then at some level, yes, Saskatchewan and Alberta in particular are landlocked. But we're part of a country that is not landlocked. We're part of a country that has the biggest coast in the entire world. And so it is galling that that other provinces can decide, that a Quebec or a BC can decide whether Alberta and Saskatchewan can reach global markets or not. And there is federal jurisdiction. That is the right and the responsibility of the federal government to not abide by provincial parochial interests, and to look at the health and the fairness of the system as a whole, and to say, yes, at a minimum, Alberta and Saskatchewan should get access to global markets and to tidewater and be able to export their products. And when we can't, We had one customer and it went down south. And that was why, because it was easier for us to negotiate access to the American market than to negotiate through the provinces to access global markets.
And only across your own border.
And the vast majority of Canadians don't like that, want to export more east and west. And so I don't even think it should take that much courage for political parties. When 81% of Canadians want pipelines, it shouldn't be such a hard debate to say, you know what, you have the base, you have the support behind you if you want to build a pipeline.
Okay, so how do you, and then I'll go to Sonya in just a minute here, but how do you reconcile C5 and we need to have these projects, we want to become an energy superpower and the feds can use this power if they want, with the statements that also come out of Ottawa, which is every province has a veto. We won't, that's still on the books. That's they
don't. And this is the absurdity, and Sonya will have opinions. The absurdity is the Trudeau Liberals actually pushed Trans Mountain very hard. BC was the biggest problem for Trans Mountain, not the federal government. And we have so much recent federal jurisprudence to say, actually, you don't need BC to approve. They said that they're going to use every tool in the toolbox to stop that pipeline. They didn't have the tools. The tools were all the federal government's, and the federal government pushed ahead. So we've very clearly established that provinces don't have a veto. What we require in good faith in a confederation is that everyone works together in good faith towards solutions, and that you don't object in principle without basis on the impacts, that you're looking for solutions with the others to find a compromise. And we have not been seeing that from all other governments thus far.
Sonya, go ahead.
I'm watching really closely what Premier Eby is saying, and he's been nuanced and cautious with his words, and he's not saying a whole lot different than what Christy Clark was saying when Northern Gateway was being built. When Northern Gateway was being built, BC government imposed five conditions on pipelines. But they have no jurisdiction to do it. Pipelines are federal jurisdictions, but they imposed five conditions. Most were around safety and environmental protection, coastal safety, tanker safety, but one was on BC gets a fair share. And we could never really get around that at that time. What I'm hearing from David Eby, he's just saying, well, there's no proponent right now. There's not a project, there's not a proponent, so let's not talk about it. He hasn't really said no. But when it comes down to it, it's going to be the Prime Minister's responsibility to build national consensus. That's the Prime Minister's responsibility. It's not up to the Prime Minister to leave it to just the provinces to fight it out. He's going to have to step in and broker a deal if he wants a national project to be built. And I don't know how, if he realizes how tough that's going to be, how tough that's going to be. But it's going to have a lot of challenges building a pipeline through BC. I mean, I saw that. I spent 9 years working on Northern Gateway pipeline, and then I saw all the back and forth of TMX when it was being built when I was in the provincial government, and the resistance, including legislative resistance coming from BC. It's not easy, but if the Prime Minister is prepared to step in and show leadership on a national project, it can be done, and it will be done.
Heather, I wanted to ask you one other thing that's sort of been in and out of the news this week, which is supposedly a report which was in The Economist magazine that in these negotiations that the Prime Minister is having with Donald Trump on the 2.0 NAFTA, whatever we call it, Kuzma, there's so many references, that he's talked about sort of a right of first refusal on energy for the U.S., and the stories kind of disappeared. What do you make of that? Is that maybe more on the critical minerals issue, because Trump's also in the middle of this discussion with China right now, and that might have been something we said as opposed to all oil and gas and energy, which would be a little bizarre in the face of what the whole election campaign was about.
Yeah, and I think people know that critical minerals is going to play a big role in Kuzma renegotiations, and there's been talk that he would have its own separate chapter. And you can see with Trump's rhetoric on Greenland, on Ukraine, and even on Canada, that they're quite focused on security of supply of critical minerals. That particular Economist article I never got to read the live version, as
Right.
you know, Senator, because it was removed. And so that tells me that it was obviously wrong and they were requested to remove it and then they did. So which kernel of truth is right about the article then? And one, one theory I've heard is that it was first right of refusal versus Chinese purchases of critical minerals and mining, which to me, I'm happy to do that. And I can see the negotiation. It is almost impossible for Canadian miners you can't make it illegal to not work with the Chinese because in some minerals, they're the only processor. There's no one else that can process. And we have tremendous trade. They're our second biggest trading partner. So no one is saying make it illegal to trade with China. And as we know with canola, we're trying to say make it easier to trade with China, actually. And so you can't say no more Chinese investment or no more participation, no more selling to the Chinese. But yet, as a NATO ally and appreciating the Chinese are an adversary, I think a first right of refusal for the United States, say if you don't want China in this sphere, if you don't want them to have access, if you want to obtain that market share, yes, I would support giving the Americans first right of refusal before we sell to the Chinese.
Yeah, and I think there's a big difference between oil and gas and critical minerals. For
Right.
LNG and oil and gas, there's long-term supply agreements and offtake agreements already in place. And I don't see anybody wanting to stop Canada from supplying LNG to Europe or to Japan and Korea. I think that's within Canada's national interest and within the US national interest. Same with oil. But when it comes to critical minerals, it's the markets are still being developed. Especially I'm involved with some lithium projects, and those markets are still being developed. Right now, China has a lock on those markets. They have a lock on the processing, and they've been at it for over a decade, spending billions of dollars to secure everything from the resource extraction to the processing to the advanced manufacturing. And it's come to the point where it's not only an economic security concern for the United States and Canada, but it's national security. It's got defense and military applications. And China has been showing predatory behavior. So I don't have a problem with trying to lock in some of these markets and a Fortress North America framework for critical minerals. And in fact, for Canada, we need that North American market. We need the US market. That's the largest market where we could supply in. That's where the largest source of capital investment could come from to invest in these projects and help get them across the finish line. So I don't know what that term might be intended to mean, but if it's for critical minerals, I think it's actually a good thing.
Can I just end here on the larger question, I guess, which is the government still seems intent on getting to net zero. Its plan for EV vehicles and taking oil and gas or gas-driven vehicles off the roads. The industrial carbon tax will stay. For now, the production caps or the emission caps will be there. Can we do both in this country? Heather, I'm going to start with you. Can we really get to net zero and be an energy superpower?
I just think that net zero is the wrong goal. The right goal is for Canada to be the cleanest, best producer in the world. And if we are that, on what grounds can people criticize our industries? And so, and this is true that on almost all of our commodities, whether you're talking about mineral or agricultural or for conventional natural gas and oil, we are usually in the top decile or top quartile of environmental performance. And it's because, one, we have this clean grid with lots of hydro. So when you are using electricity in your operations, it's quite clean. Two, that usually what we're developing in Canada is a very high quality resource. It's expensive to develop here, so people are attracted to the very high quality deposits. And so that's just easier to process and you have less of an intense footprint there. And then three, because we do have very high world-class environmental and regulatory standards. So every time you displace Canadian production and Canadian exports in any commodity, what you're doing is opening the market for more polluting exports, and not only more polluting, including often adversarial competitors such as China and Russia. So this navel gazing of our own emissions and reducing our own has again totally ignored the global emissions impact and the role that we should be playing in making sure we have a large market share and making sure just that we're doing the best. If you're producing in the top 10% of all your competitors, it's outrageous that the government would come in and say, no, you need to be more stringent. We need to make it harder for you to produce. We should be better, not smaller.
This is the question, Sonya, that I think everybody has. Like, we have this endless debate about, pipelines and other transportation modes, east and west. And we've got parts of our country that are importing dirty oil and oil from thug producers. And somehow that's better than having a pipeline.
Yeah, well, I'll just jump in a little bit on the net zero question, because I was the environment minister in Canada, in Alberta, when we brought in our climate strategy in 2023 that had a net zero ambition. We weren't going to legislate it and we weren't going to make it mandatory because there is so much hard work to do and uncertainties to actually get it together. But what we determined is you have no path to net zero if you don't combine your climate policy, your environment policy with industrial policy and with energy policy. You can't put climate policy first. If you fall apart on the others, you're not going to achieve it. So it has to make economic sense. What you're investing in on climate has to make economic sense. And what we found in it is all of Ottawa's climate policies were actually adverse to achieving their climate change objectives because they were prescriptive, they were regulatory, they were mandatory in trying to impose rules that industry couldn't meet. So what happened? Industry just doesn't invest. So it actually slowed down their climate change objectives. So I don't know if we can get to net zero by 2050, but we certainly aren't if we're going to destroy our competitiveness and we're not going to link it with industrial policy. And we're, to the extent that, and that just leads into all that, what you mentioned about importing oil from other jurisdictions versus using our own. It all feeds into that last nightmare decade of Justin Trudeau policies that made no sense. To import oil from other jurisdictions at a higher environmental footprint, as opposed to develop our own and lower the emissions there. Hopefully we're beyond that decade and can start looking at some more sensible policies.
Well, and to look at our contribution globally, if we can, by exporting cleaner oil and gas to nations that are using dirty oil and gas, then we are helping the global picture, Heather. Our contribution as a country is pretty small relative to, India, China, etc. So if we can help Europe and other countries get off dirty energy, then we are making a contribution.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been quite clear, well documented, that our LNG is the cleanest in the world. So again, if we don't produce LNG, someone with a higher emitting product is going to be filling that market. It's very true of conventional. But I have to say, because bitumen gets such a bad rap on the oil sands, if you compared apples to apples, because people actually need heavy oil, you actually need that crude of oil and the refineries that require it. Again, our competitors on the heavy oil side do not have the lowest emissions, a lower emissions profile than we do. We are better than average comparing heavies to heavies. But if we did have something like a Pathways Alliance, and if I was a corporation, I wouldn't be able to say this because it's against the Greenwashing Amendment, because I'm speaking aspirationally about the future. If we did have something like Pathways, and if you compare it to the emissions reductions they have been able to achieve under a good industrial policy, as Sonya mentioned, it will actually even be lower than the global average on a life cycles basis, which we're only about 1% to 3% higher right now. And so not even compared to other heavies, just compared to all the average of all other crudes, we could get Canadian bitumen underneath that. And that's what we should be focusing on, not an emissions cap, because you could never afford to do that. You can't afford Pathways Alliance if there's emissions cap, if you can't grow production on the other end. And so just finding those ways that industry is saying we can lower emissions at the lowest cost, doing it this way, and let's support that.
Yeah, and I just want a final word, Sonya, because you have been a minister trying to deal with this, because we've referenced it a couple of times. But this greenwashing legislation, I mean, this was actually legislation that says you have to be very careful about what you say about your environmental claims and how clean your product is, because you might be punished by law for making claims that others could challenge. It just seems, I don't know, outrageous in 2025.
It is, and it was. Heather and I also wrote a paper on Bill C-59, the Greenwashing Amendment, and how onerous it is. And in fact, what it takes the Competition Act that's meant to apply to consumers, consumer protection, and expands it to apply to everything businesses say about what they're doing and what their future goals are. And that makes it impossible for them to have future goals or communicated about them, because they can't meet tests and it's backed with huge fines. So it's more than just difficult for corporations to talk about it. It's impossible. So I haven't heard any movement out of Ottawa to make some amendments to that piece of legislation and to walk back some of those changes. Heather and I, in our paper, gave some very, very constructive examples of what they could do to walk it back. And at a minimum, there's one section that should and could be repealed that would make a world of difference to companies that want to pursue net zero ambitions and environmental objectives.
Well, and to talk to potential funders and, about what they do. If you can't say what you're doing is cleaner, it's hard to raise money for cleaner projects.
100%.
All right. We will be back to you, I think, and we'll let everything settle. You two are being very generous, saying we're going to give everybody the benefit of the doubt, see how it works. So we'll come back and see what you think in a few months on this. So great to talk with you both. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
That's great. Sonya Savage, former Minister of Energy and the Environment in Alberta, and back to her legal career, senior counsel at Borden Ladner Gervais, and a fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, where Heather Exner-Pirot is, as well as a senior fellow and director of Energy, Natural Resources and Environment, and a special advisor to the Business Council. And you're really doing the heavy lifting on what needs to happen and the kind of legislative changes that need to happen to make us that energy superpower that everybody says they want us to be. So let's move forward. Thanks so much for joining us today, and thanks to everybody else who was with us for this conversation on this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. See you very soon.